use the mic.
Okay, absolutely. Hello there, everybody.
Hello. Hey, Austin.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me. Now, today is the anniversary of Roe versus Wade, if you knew that already. And in honor of that, in honor of all of the children that have died to this absolutely dreadful Supreme Court decision, we have a few precious feet. Now, these precious feet, they're the exact same size and shape as a 10-week-old baby's feet. And we've brought quite a few here for you today. If you would like to get them, my mother's at that table back there. And she would love to hand those out to you. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. These are the first words of one of the greatest written documents of all time, our U.S. Constitution. Our Constitution is the greatest foundation of liberty known to man. Our founding fathers were the leaders in a unique and noble experiment of liberty and self-government. These amazing men sacrificed everything to create a blueprint for a nation, the first of its kind in history. Our founders' generation is truly one of the greatest generations of all time. These amazing men were willing to sacrifice their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honors. The founders' generation produced patriots such as Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Adams, and Henry, who are the greatest political thinkers and constitutional scholars in American history. Their generation gave us the United States. We owe it to them to do what we can to preserve our Constitution. We must make sure that our Constitution is being interpreted correctly, because if it is not, then our freedom is not safe. But how do we do this? In order to truly interpret any important document correctly, we need to go back and look at the history of the times and the writings of the founders to get their original intent. David Forte, professor of law and Reagan administration's chief counsel to the United Nations, suggests we ask the question, what would the founders think in order to interpret their Constitution? Instead of asking, how would I interpret this, we should be asking, how would the founders interpret this? We need to go back to their writings to truly seek the Constitution that they created, and not the Constitution that some may want it to be. Our founding fathers gave us three branches of government. Three branches whose power comes from we the people and is restrained by our Constitution. Our founding fathers gave us a government dependent upon the consent of the governed. That's our consent, not the will of the Supreme Court, Congress, or the President. So what would our founding fathers think about today's Supreme Court? Well, the Supreme Court was not originally meant to be the ultimate arbiter of the constitutionality of the law. Believe it or not. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and the Supreme Court is supposed to uphold the Constitution in all decisions. Only the United States Constitution. Any other form of law is simply unacceptable. Patrick Henry said that liberty ought to be the direct end of your government. Now remember that quote. However, the Supreme Court has been upholding many other nations' decisions in our recent court cases. Take, for example, the decision of Graham versus Florida. Now, the decision was about striking down laws that allowed juveniles to be sentenced to life without parole, or LWOP, for non-homicidal crimes. Now, whether or not the decision was justified is certainly up to you. But what struck me was when reading the opinion written by Justice Kennedy, he stated that LWOP has been, quote, rejected the world over. the judgment of the world's nations that a particular sentencing practice is inconsistent with basic principles of decency suggests that the court's rationale has respected reasoning to support it. Now, I have a couple of problems with the statement. First of all, this is a logical fallacy called the bandwagon fallacy, which says that since everybody else is doing it, it must be right. Well, this is where the whole "if so-and-so jumped off a cliff, would you do it too" came from. Yeah, like Mom always says, just because everybody else is doing it does not make it right. Now, the second problem I have with this is that we are basing our decisions of law on other nations' rulings of law. The reason that our country, our Constitution, and our laws are different from any other nation's is because they were meant to protect our rights as opposed to limiting them. By upholding other nations' laws and our decisions, we effectively limit our own rights and do not uphold Patrick Henry's philosophy. What would our founding fathers think about what's happened to the legislature? Now, when the legislative process was being developed, our founders wanted everyone to have equal representation, and not just a few men. Because as Alexander Hamilton said, give all the power to the many, and they will oppress the few. Give all the power to a few, and they will oppress the many. Both therefore ought to have power, that each may defend itself against the other. The way that the representation system in our legislative branch was set up allowed for a nearly seamless system of checks and balances. Everyone had representation. The people had the House of Representatives, and the states had the Senate. Unfortunately, in 1913, the 17th Amendment came around. The 17th Amendment caused a huge failure in our system of checks and balances, leaving the states without any representation in our federal government, fulfilling Hamilton's worst nightmare. And finally, and probably most importantly, what would our founding fathers think about what has happened to the presidency? Oh my, where to begin? What would our founding fathers think about a president who changes federal law without going through the legislative process? What would our founding fathers think about a president who makes recess appointments when Congress is only in temporary adjournment? What would our founding fathers think about a president who grants amnesty to 5 million illegal immigrants? Let's take a look at what's called an executive order. Now, an executive order stems from the president's duty as commander-in-chief, as well as his ability to respond to a crisis. However, in order to enact an executive order, which first of all isn't directly found in the Constitution, and second of all has the same force and power as law, the president has to either have power from the Constitution or power from the Congress. Recently, many executive orders have circumvented Congress and ignored the Constitution altogether. This is exactly the opposite of what our founding fathers wanted. Are our justices, legislators, and executives interpreting the Constitution the way the founders wrote it? I don't think so. We see that instead of asking, how would the founders interpret this, that they are simply asking, how do I want to interpret this? Anytime that our federal government does anything, we need to ask ourselves, what would the founders think? What would the founders think about our $18 trillion debt and our $500 billion spending deficit? What would the founding fathers think about prayer, the Bible, and the 10 Commandments being banned in our public schools? What would the founding fathers think about a president who doesn't even salute at a military memorial service? You see, our Constitution was not solely created to make a central government. Our Constitution was made to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Andrew Jackson said in his farewell address that you must remember, my fellow citizens, eternal vigilance by the people is the price of liberty. And we must be willing to pay the price if we wish to secure the blessing. George Washington pledged that the Constitution is the guide which I will never abandon. I ask us to all pledge today, alongside Andrew Jackson, alongside Patrick Henry, alongside Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, and all of our founding fathers, that we will, with eternal vigilance, always protect, always support, and never abandon our Constitution. Thank you so much for letting me come out here and speak to you guys today. Thank you so much. Now, is it okay if I open up for questions for a little bit?
Sure.
Is that okay? Alrighty. Do we have any questions?
Where do you go to school?
I'm homeschooled by my wonderful mother.